The story today is quite an intricate story about modern humans who pitted themselves against extinction right here on our southern coast, right on our doorstep in Mossel Bay. And it's quite an intricate story because the survival against really severe paleoenvironmental changes and sea levels was quite a battle to be fought. But the man best suited for the job to explain it all to you is Professor himself. And thank you very much for coming. And the floor is yours.
Thanks for that wonderful and warm introduction. I want to recognize the team of scientists that a lot of the work that I'm going to tell you about rests on their shoulders. You know, science today has really become a big team effort, and I'd say that's one of the major advances that we've made in the last 10, 15 years is a transition to these highly multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams. And so I'm the project director. I orchestrate the team, and I have a big influence on the intellectual goals. But a lot of the real hard work, the specific things that I'm going to talk to you about, come from that team. So our team is, the acronym is SACP4. You can see it has a long name with lots of paleos. And we think of ourselves today as, instead of paleoanthropologists and paleoclimatologists, as paleoscientists, right? We're trying to pull together lots of different types of evidence. The title has a bit of a drama to it, Survivors on the Edge of Land and Sea, and I'll talk a little bit about why it has some drama. And what I thought I would do tonight is kind of bring you up to date on what we know about the origins of modern humans, the origins of us. And particularly a focus on what the South African record has to say about that. And you might be surprised to know that the South African record right now dominates the record worldwide. This is the place where most of the new advances are being made. And there's several teams of scientists who are contributing to that. My team is one of them, so then I'll bring it straight down to Pinnacle Point so that you can see what's happening there. And since I was invited by the people at Pinnacle Caves, I've managed to squeeze in some research that we're doing on stalagmites. And they have a lot of them in Kango. And we can use stalagmites as very high resolution archives of climate change. And I will use the work of our team to explain how the climate changed here along the South African coast over a very long period of time. And then use that to contextualize what's happening in terms of human origins. Okay, so those are the things I'll be talking about. Hopefully I'll succeed at pulling them all together for you. Now, I want to start with what the major scientific questions are. And I was trained as an archaeologist, and we're interested in human behavior. And one of the things that social scientists have recognized is that modern humans are a super unique species. And I think anybody can recognize that. Every species is unique, but modern humans are an extreme outlier in a variety of ways. And there are two things that we have that are fundamentally different than what any other species has. One of them is we're uniquely pro-social. And what I mean by that is that we have unique behaviors that don't really follow standard models of rationality. We can be uniquely generous. And importantly, we can be uniquely generous to non-kin. So in classic biological models of behavior, it's easy to explain animals behaving generously to their kin, their offspring, and so on. It's really hard to explain that kind of behavior with non-kin, and humans express it on a regular basis. And a big part of that is that we cooperate in large groups with genetically unrelated individuals. And so we form these extensive social networks with people. And that is the foundation of the extraordinary things that we can accomplish as groups, right? And it has a dark side and it has a light side. The dark side is we often cooperate in groups to make war, right? The light side is we cooperate in groups to solve really complicated problems. Building of cities, construction of highways, civilizations, right? That's what's so fascinating about that topic. And then the other thing is we have this highly sophisticated cognition, super advanced brain, an organic computer like no other animal has. And that allows language and art and other symbolic systems, but also this extraordinary cumulative culture that we build up that is passed on from generation to generation by very complex teaching. So we're very interested in when these things happen and under what context they happen. And the South African record has some very interesting things to say about that. And hopefully I'll be able to communicate that. So when and why did these uniquely human traits evolve? That becomes the question that as a scientist we're interested in. And to answer that question, we need to work in big teams of people. It's not just archaeologists. Psychologists, cognitive scientists, mathematical modelers, etc. are needed to answer it. And I think that we are near a synthetic theory. So when we have in science synthetic theories, it results in a major advance in the research. Things all come together all of a sudden. And so, for example, you know, in biology, natural selection theory was a big synthetic theory that allowed biology to make major advances. Continental drift in geology, breakthrough synthetic theory that then allowed lots of new advances. And I think in the social sciences we're getting to that point. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring you up to date on the latest information that we have for the evolution of modern humans. And what I've done is at the bottom, I've put a climate curve from the deep sea core, or the ice cores in Antarctica. And that's 800,000 years ago. And when that line is in blue, we're in a glacial phase, a cold phase. And when it's in the red, we're in an interglacial phase. And we are in a warm phase right now. We call that Paleocene. And we know that there are two major lineages of people on the planet, roughly from 800,000 years ago. And I'll call one lineage the Eurasian archaic lineage, and that includes Neanderthals. You've probably heard of the hominid Neanderthals. And then we have the modern human lineage, and that leads to everybody alive on the planet today. So we know from the fossil record and the genetic record that that Eurasian lineage and the African lineage share a common ancestor right about 700,000 years ago. And there's gene flow between them up until about 400,000 years ago. And then that gene flow gets cut. And when gene flow gets cut, isolated populations start to move away from each other. And they evolve into different species. So that Eurasian one evolves into Neanderthals, and the African one evolves into modern humans. And then we just recently found, 3 years ago, from DNA that was extracted from the finger bone in the Altai Mountains in Russia, that there was a third lineage, and we call them the Denisovans, and that's because the cave that finger bone comes from is called Denisovan Cave. And they broke away from Neanderthals around 200,000 years ago. So we had Denisovans in Eastern Asia, we had Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, right, Europe mostly, and modern humans evolving in Africa. The genetic record and the fossil record shows that our lineage, so in other words, the lineage that leads to everybody alive on the planet today, appears sometime between 200,000 and 120,000 years ago. That lineage appears at that moment. And notice they appear during a glacial phase. Okay? So the time that our lineage appeared, the world's climate was nothing like it is today, because we're in an interglacial, a warm phase. Then, sometime around 50,000 years ago, a small group of Africans leave Africa and give rise to all Eurasians. So by Eurasians, I mean everybody who is of European and Asian descent. And we know that that group of Africans was small, a couple hundred. So that's what we call a founder population. So they leave Africa and they head east to Eastern Asia, and they head west to Western Europe. But something very interesting happens. The founder group interbreeds with Neanderthals. So all Eurasians have around 3% of their DNA as Neanderthal. Africans don't have that. Okay, so that's one of the fundamental differences in the genome between these two populations. But then, of course, Neanderthals were extinct. And then we have all these other lineages, okay, start to break off. And they form the major ethno-linguistic groups of the world. So Australians, Australian Aborigines, Melanesians, Chinese, Japanese, etc., etc. And there is a little interbreeding with Denisovans by this Melanesian Aborigine lineage. So they have genes of that now extinct population. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is what we know about the origin of modern humans. And I have used this basic slide for about 10 years. And every 6 months I have to update it. That's how fast scientific progress is taking place. And a lot of it is coming out of the genetic work, right? Because now that we've sequenced the entire human genome, we can extract DNA from fossils and compare it to the modern human genome, right? It's created a breakthrough work for us. We know that there was an ancient African lineage that's now extinct, and they interbred with Africans right after that Eurasian lineage broke off. That's a very recent result, last year. Okay, now I just want to point out that I've already noted that our lineage appears during this long, cold glacial stage from about 200,000 years ago until about 120,000 years ago. And we know from the genetic record of modern humans that that population was small. Now, there's a lot of debate over how small it was. Some people say it was several thousand individuals. Some people say it was a couple hundred individuals. And that's what we call a bottleneck. It's a genetic bottleneck. So the modern human species almost went extinct. There was a small number left. Because when your population is down to a couple thousand, you can have one thing go wrong, and you lose everybody, right? So one of the questions we're interested in is, where did that small population live? Where were they? Africa's a big place. Were they in East Africa, North Africa, South Africa? And I've argued in several publications. The scholarly publication is in Journal of Human Evolution, and there's a general version of the argument in Scientific American magazine. That founder population for all modern humans was in the Cape. And the reason behind that argument is that the very rich coastal zone that you have here, plus the super high diversity of geophytic plants that we have, which are a preferred food for hunter-gatherers, so the below ground tuberous plants, those two together made this place a good refuge during glacial environments. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that argument because it's something I published a while ago, and I've talked about it a lot, and I prefer now to talk about some newer stuff if that do it. So, but I can, if you're interested, I can send you a PDF. So let's get back to that question. When do those behavioral characters in modern humans, that complex cognition and the pro-social behavior, the fact that we can all walk in here and we're unrelated and sit down and listen to me talk on for 45 minutes. Imagine trying to get chimps to do that. It's impossible. I have a colleague of mine who studies chimpanzees, and she often says, imagine trying to get 200 chimps to line up at an airline counter, take a ticket, get on a plane, fly and be abused for 8 hours and then get off that plane. She said what would happen is one chimp would walk off. That's it. All the others would be dead. How is it we got to the point we can cooperate in this way? To me, right now, that's one of my main scientific interests. So what do we need to do? We need to have proxies to recognize these behaviors in the archaeological record. And then we need to have hypotheses that have sharp test implications that guide our fieldwork. So what I mean by that is we need to theorize about where we would find that record so that we don't end up digging in the wrong places. See what I mean? You know, we don't throw darts at a map when we start to dig because it's very costly to do that. We have to have very good reasons to choose the places that we want to excavate. So here's some hypotheses that I've put forth. I think that those last two features, that prosociality and complex cognition, happen after the split with Neanderthals, and thus they happened in Africa. And they probably happened sometime between 200,000 and 160,000 years ago. And those are the foundation characteristics of the archaeogenic lineage. Okay, so our lineage evolved those characteristics. It gave them a super advantage, and that's why we're the only lineage left. And I think South Africa played a special role in that ascent. There's lots of arguments for why that is. I'm not going to get into them now, but that's why I'm working here, right? That and the good food and wine. There is a reason. Okay, so what are our proxies? How do we recognize symbolic thought? Well, we can recognize it when we find symbolic things in the archaeological record. And rock art is one of those. But rock art is pretty recent for the most part. And that's because cave surfaces are constantly exfoliated. Right? We lose the rock art over time. But humans symbol in lots of different ways. And these are two Hadza girls. The Hadza are an ethno-linguistic group of hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And you can see they symbol their group affiliation with scarification. But scarification is invisible in the archaeological record. And so that's invisible to us. But they also symbol their group affiliation with jewelry. And you can see they have two different kinds of ostrich shell bead necklaces. The beads on this one are bigger, and they're smaller on this one. And she also has these, little boards on her necklace. And they can tell what group they belong to by the jewelry. And we do the same thing, right? With your jewelry, you symbol the group you belong to, the religion you belong to, the economic group you belong to, sometimes the cultural group. Modern humans also have these very long, complex chain recipe technologies. And those recipes require language for what we would call high-fidelity transmission. So in other words, transmission of a recipe consistently through time. And so for example, these Eskimo have super complex technologies that probably have 30 or 40 different steps. And you get one step wrong, and the whole technology collapses. So we can use the presence of complex technologies to recognize high intelligence. But also, modern humans recognize what we call novel associations between seemingly unrelated phenomena. These are the genius moments. Okay, so the guy who one day visualized a hook and a loop and invented Velcro. That's a genius moment. That is a recognition of two unrelated things and putting them together to make a really fabulous technology. And you're probably thinking, why am I showing you this grub right now? Okay, well this Khoisan individual right here, Bushman individual, they take this grub, which lives in the dead roots of a tree in the Kalahari, and they grind it up into a mush, and he puts it on that little dart right there, which he fires with a very small bow, and he can kill the biggest animal in the bush with that. Now that is a breakthrough technology, and if any of you are hunters, you know that that last moment, when that animal is dying, and you go up to finish it off, that's the most dangerous moment. It's hectic, because that animal's instinct is screaming into its brain to lurch to its feet one last time and bury its horns in your guts. But with that weapon right there, when you walk up to that animal, it's paralyzed. It's a breakthrough technology. But how the heck did they recognize that a grub that you can mush up is a deadly poison that lets you kill a giraffe? Humans have that capability, right? Everybody's got it. So when we see those genius moments in the archaeological record, that's a signal to us that the human cognition is there. It's apparent. And we form these large interconnected social networks, right? And they often have stylistic markers that symbol the networks and the groups that people belong to. So here's another example, a fabulous paper by a colleague of mine, where she studied the shapes of projectile points from 3 different Khoisan ethno-linguistic groups. These are groups that speak a totally different language from each other. Khoisan, Hui, and Ko. And they use very different projectile points. And it's all style. It's just symboling what group they belong to. And you can recognize another guy by his point. So when we start to find that kind of structure in the archaeological record, we can say, oh, we're now getting those network affiliations present in the record. So those are some of the things we look for as an archaeologist, right? That's what we're trying to find so we can figure out how it happened, how our unique species occurred. Now, South Africa, and particularly this stretch of coastline, has the richest record for this and the oldest record anywhere in the world. And that's why there's so much scientific interest in it. So here I put a very brief summary of the age of the sites that are important to this. So this axis is 40,000 years ago and 180,000 years ago. Klaasius River on the southeast coast, Bloembos near Stilbaai, that many of you know about, Deep Cliff over on the west coast near Elands Bay, new site that's getting a lot of attention. Boomplaats in your own backyard, very important site. And Sibutu, right up on the east coast. So other than Sibutu, these are all coastal sites in the Cape Floristic region. And here's the Pinnacle Point record that we've developed over the last 15 years of field work. And the reason we can see straight away, one of the reasons Pinnacle Point is so important is we have the longest record. Our record from a variety of different sites goes all the way back to 160,000 years ago. And if you've been paying attention, you remember that 160,000 years ago, that's the origin point of our language. That's when the bottleneck occurred. That's when there was a very small number of people. And we have sites that date to that period. There are 3 sites in all of Africa that date to that period. So it's one reason why Pinnacle Point is so important. That occupation. Okay, so a few things about what we have found and what we know. This is a 3-dimensional model of Pinnacle Point, but it still had a sewage system instead of a high 5-star golf course and resort. I don't know if anybody here had been to Pinnacle Point when this was still here, but it was just bush. We started working when it looked like this, and every day when we arrived to start climbing down to the caves to do our work, they would turn on the sewage system and start agitating the solid waste. It was unpleasant. So Pinnacle Point, the caves look like this. They're all high sea level caves. They've been cut by high sea levels. PP13B is the most famous one that we've published on, and we're now starting to publish on another. This is my team at Pinnacle Point doing excavations. We use total stations which send out lasers to measure everything that we find is measured with a laser to millimeter accuracy. So we have state-of-the-art field technique. Our first major result was published in 2007. It was published in Nature. And that paper is important for a number of reasons. We showed that people were exploiting the rocky intertidal zones, ground mussel and honeycoical 160,000 years ago. And they were even scavenging whales, because that's a fragment of a whale barnacle. It's a species of barnacle that only is found on the whale. And we know they didn't have boats, right? So they're not out hunting whales, they're not whaling. But they're scavenging the blubber and the meat and bringing it back to the cave, and the proxy is the barnacle, right? That's how they end up in the cave. Okay, so this is the earliest evidence we have for people eating coastal resources, seafood resources, still anywhere. It's published in 2007. It's the earliest result still. So this paper got a lot of attention. Now, you might ask yourself, why is that important? Well, you probably all heard of omega-3 fatty acids and how important marine foods are to your diet. But I think it's actually a signal of something more important. And that is that being a successful forager on the coast requires smarts. There's a challenge to being a coastal forager. And South African audiences often know this already, but when I give talks overseas in North America, in Chicago or something, where people rarely go to the coast, they don't get it. So I'll just explain it to you very quickly. Here's a colorway of the coastal zone on the south coast. And you know, you have these different zones and different species of shellfish in each one. Now, during a neap tide, right, only the top of the intertidal zone is available. And even the top is hard to get a good catch from during a neap tide, right? And during neap tides, right, the moon and the sun are out of alignment, and the gravitational forces are subtractive. And that's why in a neap tide, it only fluctuates a little bit, right? But when we go into a spring tide, and the moon and the sun are in alignment, the gravitational forces are additive, and you get the springing of the tide back and forth. And of course, spring doesn't refer to season. It means this tide springs back and forth from very high to very low, okay? Now, during a low spring tide, you can get all the way down to here and get tons of shellfish. So what we know from ethnographic accounts of coastal foragers is that coastal foragers schedule their visits to the coast based on lunar signaling. So when do you go to the coast? You go during a new moon and a full moon, because that's when the tide springs back and forth, and your returns on the food are very high. During a neap tide, there's almost nothing to get. So if you go down to Stillwater and you talk to the local people there who still collect shellfish, they'll never go during a neap tide. They think you're stupid if you do that. But springtime, they go. And they time it off lunar observations. It's a lunar system, right? Okay. Tide advances 50 minutes a day. The solar calendar doesn't work. So when we see people exploiting this low spring tide, they've figured out the lunar relationship. They're tracking time, right? No other animal does that. Humans do it cognitively. Okay. And it's dangerous. And I think it's, beautifully stated by a favorite book of mine. I put the Afrikaans up here, and I'm definitely not going to read this in Afrikaans, not for this audience. But English, Benjamin, right, looks down into the gap at the waves rolling in, and he knew there would be little mercy for a man down there. In the forest, you could get yourself a gun against the biggest elephant, or a spear. Sharpen your axe against the biggest tree, but against the power of the waves, man would be helpless. Coastal foraging is dangerous, but they figured out how to do it 160,000 years ago. Okay, so here I've just summarized the evidence. So here's the time scale, 170,000 years ago, 170, 160, 125 to 120, and so on. And here's the easy part of the intertidal zone, the upper Palaeoecology zone. So you can get there during a low neap tide. Doesn't require complex cognition to do that.
Here's the caution zone. That's the lower Palaeoid zone. You can only get down there during low spring tide. And here's the really dangerous zone, the Kochlear zone. If you're down in the Kochlear zone during a neap tide, you're crazy. You're certainly not thinking like a modern human. So, 160,000 years ago, they're just using the upper Palaeoid zone. And then, around 120,000 years ago, the shellfish in the assemblages show us that they're getting into the dangerous areas. So we think that right there, about 90,000 years ago, they've developed the lunar calendar. They're timing their occupations to get to those proper places. Okay, so what does a shell maybe look like in an archaeological site? This is a stratigraphic profile at site PP56, which is a site we're digging at Pinnacle Point right now. Let me see if I can get this to go. Okay, and as we zoom in, you can see the shell deposit right there. And that dates to about 80,000 years ago. And all those little white dots that you see there are pieces of shell that we've plotted with our total stations. So what the total station allows us to do, and in red are the stone artifacts. So it allows us to see in very fine detail the spatial associations of finds that we have. So I could put up ostrich eggshell, I could put up mammal bone. We can look at the little hearts and see where things were dropped. The technology now is pretty astonishing. Here's another important result from our paper, that 2007 paper in Nature. We showed that people 160,000 years ago are using red ochre, and they are grinding it. So it's hard to see in this light, but these pieces of ochre have microstriations on them. And the microstriations come from taking the ochre and grinding it on a rock to produce a powder. And people produce ochre powders to paint their bodies and to paint cave walls. And we see it all over Africa. So we don't have the rock art, we don't have the painted skin, but we have the paint. And that's an indicator to us that 160,000 years ago, people are symboling they're symboling something. We don't know what, but they're starting to symbol. The assembling is complex coverage. In 2009, we published a paper in Science, which also got an enormous amount of attention. It's called Fire as an Engineering Tool of Early Modern Humans. And what we showed in this paper is around 160,000 years ago, people had discovered that if you take siltcrete, and you know, if you drive through decline Peru and you see those flat-topped mesas, many of those were capped by siltcretes, right? And that siltcrete right there, that yellow siltcrete, that one is from Albert. In its raw state, it's not particularly good for flaking into a stone tool. But what they discovered is if you heat it, it turns into a beautiful raw material for manufacturing stone tools. That spear point was experimentally made from that piece of silver. You can't believe it, right? But it was heat treated, which made it almost like glass, and then it flakes beautifully, and it also turns it a beautiful blood red color. And what we were able to show in this paper is that they figured out how to do it. And here's basically how you do it. You collect a lot of siltcrete, and it's only found in certain places on the landscape. You have to control the temperature very carefully. So you can't just throw it in the broth, right? Generally what happens is you build a sand bath, you stick it down in the sand, that insulates it from rapid temperature rise and fall. You get wood that's ideal for charcoal production, and you slowly drive the temperature up to 300 to 350. That's the sweet spot. You hold it there for about 8 hours, and then you slowly cool it down. And the result is that heat treatment process. Okay? So we think that represents two important cognitive features. Novel association. How did they figure out that if you do that to siltcrete, you can make a beautiful raw material? That's the genius moment, right? Fire and stone. It's the foundation of our technology. Our technology is based on heat and minerals, right? Burning carbon and banging steel. And it has its roots somewhere. And this is where it is. This is the first time we see people using heat to modify an engineering property. That's pyrotechnology. And then the process is very complex. So we think it represents a very complex technology that needs language to be passed on. Okay? So what we're trying to do is use the proxies to get at that human behavior. So let me quickly review just a few other discoveries that have been made at Pinnacle Point and elsewhere. At 110,000 years ago, we have found that people start to collect seashells. And these are two of the species that we find in the archaeological sites, dog cockles and helmet shells. If any of you know seashell collectors, you know that these are still treasured ones because they're beautiful. And how do we know they're seashells? They have beachwear on them. The only way a shell gets beachwear is when the animal is dead and it's agitated in the intertidal zone, in the sand. Okay, so they were not collected for food. The meat is gone. And seashell collecting is a deeply symbolic act. People normally collect seashells when they're embedded in a sea economy, and then they often gift them to people who are meaningful to them. We find those at about 110,000 years ago. At Blumboss Cave, they published 2 years ago a beautiful find where they have 2 perlmutt shells with the ochre and the fat that were used, that were mixed in those perlmutt shells. They are ochre mixing bowls, still with the material in them. I mean, it's an astonishing find. We rarely, if ever, find anything like that. Really clear evidence that they're mixing ochre with fats, almost certainly to use as a painting material. 100,000 years old. At Blumboss, there is, of course, the famous engraved ochre, which we know was engraved multiple times. You can use a scanning electron microscope to see that. And that result has been replicated at other sites. Klein Pitbois on the west coast also has decorated ochre, so the Blumboss find is no longer an isolated find. We have shell beads, both in South African sites and in North African sites, and they date to about 80 to 70,000 years ago. So these are people who are now wearing beads and decorations on their bodies, symbolic behavior. And recently at Deep Kloof on the west coast, a little hard to see here, but these are ostrich eggshell pieces. And we know that these were on ostrich eggshell canteens because they have the little drill hole where they drilled out the top, expelled the yolk, and then they use it as a water container. And these are decorated with cross-hatching designs. And normally people who decorate their ostrich eggshell canteens are symboling their social group affiliation with those. Now, just recently, last year, we published in Nature a paper that also got a lot of attention. They featured it on the cover. And it was interesting because the subtitle they gave was a Hello to Mars, kind of a warlike chant, and I'll explain to you why. What we were able to show is that people have developed a new stone tool technology that we think they were using on atlatls. And atlatls are spear throwers. Okay? And spear throwers give you an enormous advantage over a hand-cast spear, both in distance, power, accuracy. And we think once modern humans had that, that gave them a decisive advantage over Neanderthals. We never had atlatls. We can tell from their technology that they didn't have it. So how do we have evidence for this? Well, in South Africa, you have a stone tool technology, and this one, actually, some of the best documentation of this technology, which is called Hoynson's Port, was right here at Blumboss Cave by Henry Deacon. And then he also worked at classes where he showed the technology. And these are the stone artifacts right here. That's a scale, so those are centimeter scales. So these are little tiny things that are about this big. Okay, we call them microliths, and we have them at Pinnacle Point as well. Okay, And how does it work? How does microlithic technology work? Elsewhere in the world, it appears around 20,000 years ago. But here in South Africa, you have it back to 65, and we've shown it goes back to 70. You start with a little piece of stone, and you produce a blade. And a blade is a flake that's twice as long as it is wide. And producing blades is really hard. It takes years of training to be able to do that. And then you take the blade and you break it into even smaller pieces. Those are the microliths. And that's how small they are. Smaller than a fingernail. They're too small to use in your hand as a tool. And we know from many, many pieces of evidence that they were mounted in bone and wood. Okay? So here's some examples. These are archaeological examples of mounted microliths. So these are bone darts, atlatl darts. So those would fit on the spear thrower that would fling at an animal. And what they do is they put a groove in the dart and they glue them in. And here's some experimental examples. And the idea of this weapon is, you know, if you puncture an animal with a dart like this, it doesn't cause much damage. An animal can, a big antelope can take a thing like that and just run. But you serrate it with these microliths, and as it goes in, it just tears out the inside of the animal. That's the goal, right? So these microliths are normally used on atlatl and bow and arrow darts. Now, how do we know? Well, we've actually done experiments, and that's a PhD student of mine, Ben Scoville. So we experimentally make the microliths. We mount them on darts. We have a calibrated crossbow that's built, and then we fire it into dead animals and retrieve the stone tools and study the damage. Okay? So, and then we compare it to the damage from other processes, like a horse or hoofed animals trampling the stone, because that can also damage the stone, right? We need to be able to say those points were used as projectiles, because the damage is unique to projectile use. So this is what the experiments look like. There you can see that springbuck hanging from a piece of wood. We mount the microliths experimentally into the wood. There's our calibrated crossbow pulled back. It's got a radar gun on it so we can measure the speed. We fire it into the animal, and then we study the damage. And this is the edge, right? And that's the damage. See those little flakes there? And we build up these profiles of what damage as a projectile looks like. And what we find is that trampling creates a random pattern, and projectile use produces a very specific pattern. And when we compared it to the archaeological examples, they match that pattern of projectile use. That's how we can say they were used as projectiles, right? That's working the evidence. It's like forensics. Okay. So 70,000 years ago, South African people had developed atlatl technology. Here's a picture of Australian Aborigines from the late 1800s with atlatls. These guys were the masters of atlatl production, just incredible. And we have lots of observations of them using it. Okay. What did they hunt with those big projectile weapons? Well, here's the modern fame-boss fauna, right? The modern fame-boss fauna is small animals. Kruisbuck, steenbuck, great duiker, bushbuck. You don't need an atlatl to bring that down. In North America, they used atlatls to kill mammoth. You know, hunting one of these with an atlatl, it's like hunting a mouse with a mouse. You don't need that. Atlatls are big, powerful weapons for bringing down big animals. And in the Pleistocene, these animals were on the south coast. Big stuff. Wildebeest, zebra, and even bigger extinct animals, like the giant buffalo, which was 4 times the body size of the modern Cape buffalo. They were present there. And you might say, why? How is that? How would we have animals like that living in the fame-boss? Because those animals need rich grassland ecosystems like you have in East Africa, not shrubby fame-boss. I'm going to close my talk with explaining how that happened, how you had those communities here. And in order to do that, we need to build a model of what the ancient landscape looked like. Okay? Because we're in a glacial. Remember, these are glacial phases. And we call it a paleoscape model. And I'm just going to show you two very important papers that colleagues of mine took the lead on. This one was done by Eric Fisher. And what Eric did was he accumulated all of the bathymetric data off of the South African coast. So here's the modern coastline, right? Here's the intermontane basin, the Klein Karoo, Oudtshoorn Mountains, and Pinnacle Point is in here. And we're going to focus in on this. So this is a digital model of the continental shelf off of South Africa. And notice that you have a plain here, and then there's a sharp drop-off point, right? And that's about 150 kilometers there. That's about 200 kilometers. Oops. Oops. Okay. So here's the model, and I'm going to turn it sideways, right? And what you'll notice is that what we call the Agulhas Bank, that plane, is very gradual in its descent. Very, very gradual, like this. See? So you've got off your coast this very shallow plane with a sharp drop-off. And what that means is when sea levels drop just a little bit, the coastline goes out really far. And a plain is exposed. Okay. Now, this is what it looked like during a glacial. So here it is today, and here it is during a glacial. So off Pinnacle Point, during a full glacial, there's 100 kilometers of plain, flat plain, present. It's a whole new topography that's not present in the Cape today. And in fact, the amount of space that was revealed during glacials was the size of Ireland. The Cape region doubled in size during glacial phases. And here's the output of the computer model. So what we can do is we can take that three-dimensional landscape and we can slice it with the computer when we feed in the global sea level curve. And that was done from 420,000 years ago, 419,000, up to the present. And I'm just going to point out one time, here's 137,000 years ago. And at 137,000 years ago, the sea was 95 kilometers from the coast today, off Pinnacle Point. So you have this big plain. That's my point. During glacial phases, there's a big plain, and it's not there today. Okay. What was that plain like? What did it look like? And here comes the material for the Kangaroo Caves. We can reconstruct it from stalagmite analysis. Stalagmites are precious archives of climate change. There's no other way to say it. They are precious. And, you know, along the Cape Coast, I've explored probably 100 caves along the Cape Coast. And most of them had stalagmites. Most have been broken off and taken and lost to science, which is a disaster. But we've managed to recover some along the coast at Pinnacle Point and analyze them. And that's led by MAREAN Matthews, who's at the Israeli Geological Survey. And Mira is one of the world's foremost stalagmite or speleothem scientists. Okay, so I recruited her to the project to do this work. Now, what can we do with a stalagmite? Okay, so there's a stalagmite that's been sliced in half. It's like a tree. And here Mira has drilled it for dating. And you can date it with a technique called uranium thorium. Uranium thorium on stalagmite is the gold standard for dating. We can get dates now back 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. And the error, you can get the error down to decadal scale, like 10-year scale. That's astonishing for us. So here's her drills for dating. And here she's drilled these little tiny holes for the chemistry analysis. Now what can we learn from the chemistry? Well, Most of you are familiar with the vegetation in South Africa. And in this zone right here, you have the super unique Cape Floristic region, right? And then you have the Paleotropics, Paleoafrican tropics here. Now, this zone on the west coast is a strong winter rainfall zone. And the east coast is a strong summer rain. And the Cape Floristic region is primarily a winter rain vegetation. You all probably know this. So as you go from here to here, you go from increasing winter rain to increasing summer rain. Now, grasses follow, or plants in general follow one of two photosynthetic pathways. So in other words, the way they make energy from sunlight. And we call those pathways the C4 and the C3 pathway. C4 and C3. And winter rain grasses follow a C3 pathway. And summer rain grasses follow a C4 pathway. That's just the biochemistry of the plants. Now, the reason that's important is we can reconstruct the vegetation, the carbon isotope vegetation signature from the speleology. We can measure it. Okay? Now, here's the other really cool thing we can do. The winter rain has an oxygen 18 signal that is different from the summer rain. So the winter rain is what we call depleted in oxygen 18, and the summer rain is enriched in oxygen 18. So if we measure the oxygen 18 chemistry from a stalagmite, we can say whether most of the rain was falling in the summer or most of it was falling in the winter. Okay? Those are the basic principles. We can reconstruct from the carbon isotopes, the vegetation, and we can reconstruct from the oxygen isotopes, the rainfall. Okay. So we've measured rainfall at Mossel Bay, and we've shown the differences between the seasons. So here's our winter rain. Here's the average oxygen 18. You can see it's really low, -6. And then when we get into summer, it's 0.13. So the rain changes in its oxygen 18 signal. Okay. So I know these are a lot of squiggly lines, but I'm going to just show you the big picture. Because we published a paper in 2010 that provides a super high resolution climate record from 95,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. And it's dated with 140 uranium thorium ages down to decadal scale. So it's the highest resolution climate curve that we have for the southern hemisphere from this time. It's a very important record. And we're building more records from Pinnacle Point. We're going to publish one shortly that goes all the way back to 350,000 years ago. So not only do we do the archaeology, but we're trying to figure out the context. So what do we see from these records? Here's the carbon record, and here's the oxygen record. What it shows is, when the world is in a warm phase, okay, so these records here are sea surface temperature records from deep sea cores. When the world is warm, we have a lot of C3 grasses in a western Florida, strong fane moss, when the world is in an interglacial. And we have strong winter rain. Okay? As we move into a cold phase, a glacial, we get significantly more summer rain. So in other words, the summer rains from the east are sweeping into the Pinnacle Point region. It's because of changes in the climate dynamics. Okay? And we get C4 grasses in a more eastern Florida. So as those summer rains come in from the east coast, the vegetation comes in as well. We have a turnover. So if you had gone down to Pinnacle Point 70,000 years ago, you wouldn't find fane moss. You'd find acacia wood. Totally different. And then as the world warms again, it goes back into a C3 grass and winter rain. And of course today, we're in a warm phase where we have winter rain and fane moss vegetation. Okay. So, this is the model. This is the big kind of picture interpretation. When the world is warm, the coast is nearby, where it is today, we we get more winter rain, and we have sea-free vegetation. Western Florida, famous Florida. When we enter a cold phase, the coast is far away, right? We know that from the model, the offshore model. We get more summer rain, and we get seafloor grasses. Eastern Florida, and trees. Total different change. So that model helps us figure this out. We have fame-boss fauna when we have warm climates. We have big grazing animals when we have cold climates because those rich grasses are coming in from the eastern side. So this is our reconstruction. We have a big continental plain exposed during a glacial, a flat grassland plain. You have winter rains on the west, and you have summer rains on the east. And that sets up a perfect ecological situation for a migration. To get a migration going, you have to have a push and pull you. The animals have to have a reason to move. Why are they moving? And how do they do it? They spend the summers on the east, and as the summer rains stop and the winter rains start coming in over on the west, they migrate back and forth. So off the coast, on that plain, you had here a migratory ecosystem that looked like one of the East African systems do today. And our people, I have these targets here indicating as these animals go back and forth, they're hunting those migratory species. So what we think they were using those atlatls for was to hunt those big game. And the interesting thing is we find the atlatl technology during glacial periods. So that kind of gives you an idea of how, the environment and reconstructing the details of the environment helps us understand those technological changes. Okay, so what do we know from the record? I'm going to wrap it up now. The evidence for cognitive complexity. Traditionally, we had a lot of it in South Africa for 70,000 years ago. But we now see it all the way back to 160,000 years ago. People are using ochres, they have complex technologies like heat treatment, etc. They're learning how to use the coastal zone. And then they take that cognitive complexity out of Africa with them when they leave Africa around 50,000 years ago, and they settle the rest of the planet. So the modern human revolution is also the modern human expansion. So modern humans leave Africa 55 to 50,000 years ago. They are in Australia in a blink of an eye, 50,000 years ago. They make it to Western Europe by 45,000 years ago. And by 40,000 years ago, every other species of human on the planet is extinct. Right? Modern humans went there with their advanced technologies, their advanced cognition, and conquered the planet. So, just to wrap this up, the Pinnacle Point record and the South African record shows us that we have complex cognition probably back to 160,000 years ago. And I think that's in many ways expected because it brings the archaeological record in sync with the biological record, which suggests that our lineage begins 160,000 years ago. The populations were very small, almost archaeologically invisible. So one of the things that my team is devoting a lot of its field work to is finding sites that are back in that phase, 160, 170, 200,000. And we're having a very hard time. We found one. We think we have another one now. And the reason it's hard to find those sites is because there weren't many people. That's the challenge. People expand their diet to seafood by 160,000, and by 120 we have a true coastal adaptation in South Africa. It's the earliest coastal adaptation we have anywhere in the world. 80 to 70,000 years ago, there's a ratcheting up of material cultural complexity with lots of new technologies. And I think the key one is those new projectile technologies. That gives modern humans a decisive advantage over all other species of human, particularly the Neanderthals. The South African record has our world's most important record for documenting these key elements of human origins. And Pinnacle Point and the South Coast, I think, have been particularly prominent. And we have several new, very exciting things that you will be hearing about in the near future. So I want to acknowledge the United States National Science Foundation. They pay for most of our work. The High Family Foundation, my institute at ASU, particularly my team in Mossel Bay, Tina, Cindy, Lawanda, and Dixon Strode. They're 5 local Mossel Bay folk that we've trained in all of our field lab methods. We employ them all year round. One of the teams has been working with me for 10 years. They make our field work. South African authorities for providing us with permits, the Mossel Bay community, and in particular the Oudtshoorn Museum complex in the municipality of Cape Nature. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions if you have.
Is there any relationship between your work and Cave?
Okay, well, you know what? That's a good question. You know what's one of the things that's interesting is that the cradle is rich in a record that dates, let's say, between 2.5 million and 1.5 million. But it's not as rich in the record that dates to 100,000, 200,000. The Cape has that record, really rich. So they're really two different records. The one up in the cradle is very important for the origins of the hominid lineage and things like bipedality and the transition to early Homo, first earliest small brains. The record here in the Cape is rich for the transition to people like us, the origins of modern humans. So they're different but complementary. That's what makes South Africa, one of the things that makes South Africa very special, is you have both records, but they're geographically separated from each other. So those records, so for example, the earliest technology we have is called Oudtshoorn, right? Oudtshoorn technology is just stone broken, a couple of flakes. That dates back to 2.6 million years ago. There's no Oudtshoorn technology in the Cape. The technology, the earliest stone tools here probably date to about 1 million years ago. But you have Oudtshoorn up in the cradle. So early hominids were not living in the fables. And that alone is an interesting question. Why? Why not? Yeah.
I've got 3 questions if I might. Is it only proxies that you use for the assumption that the wood that very small microliths were put into wood or bone? It's just the evidence of the view.
There's 2 types of evidence. Okay, there is the damage on the tool itself. So damage always is on the sharp edge. So that little flat edge doesn't have the damage. So what that means is the flat edge is protected by something. Okay? And then the second thing is the glue. Yes, we have the remnants of the glue on some of the microliths. And you can see it's the flat blunted part that always has the glue. So the business end is outside.
Can I ask the other 2 questions together? Because
sure.
The paper that's just been produced about the skull that's been found in Europe, that's changing the way people are thinking about it.
Right, that's the Denisovans fossils.
That's right. Is it going to affect our belief that knowledge that we, as Homo sapiens, appeared about 190,000 years ago? That leads me to, if we appeared in Ethiopia 190,000 years ago and we seem to be finding refuge in Mossel Bay 164,000 years ago, do you have any theories about what that migration pattern would be?
Right. So the Denisovans fossils date to about 1.8 million years. Okay, so that's similar age to the cradle. The Denisovans stuff is in Georgia, the modern country of Georgia. And the thing that's, I guess, most spectacular about Denisovans is the preservational state of the fossils. So you have whole crania, even the face is preserved. Really unusual for that. Now, what that represents is after early Homo evolves, so early Homo, Homo habilis, if you want to call it that, earliest dates to about 2.3 million. There is an initial migration event out of Africa by early Homo. And the Denisovans fossils are part of that initial migration out. Okay? You may have heard of the Flores hominids, the so-called hobbit, right? That's in Indonesia. That is a remnant of the initial migration out. So we have this initial migration out, and early Homo in Eurasia and Africa evolves into Homo erectus. Okay? Homo erectus in Europe evolves into the Neanderthals. Homo erectus in Eastern Asia evolves into Denisovans, presumably, and maybe other hominids that we haven't discovered yet. And in Africa, it ultimately evolves into modern humans. And then modern humans leave Africa, and all the other hominids go extinct. So we have multiple out of Africa events. The final one is the one that results in the pattern that we see today. Okay? Now, so that's a very brief, simplistic overview of the pattern, but yeah, that's the context for the Denisovans fossils.
The other one was, do you have any theories about the evolution? I mean, the migration from Ethiopia?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is. I'm going to bring up the map of Africa. Okay. Okay. So if you can imagine. Okay, so we go into a glacial phase around 200,000 years ago, and it lasts until 125. And here's a map of Africa in the kind of modern vegetation. So you have the Sahara, it's a giant desert, and this is wooded, this is forest, grassland, woodland, Cape Floristic region. So older than 200,000 years ago, roughly from 250 to 200, we're in an interglacial. And it's a very wet one. So the Sahara at that time was a grassland ecosystem. And we have lakes and rivers and stuff that had crocodiles and hippos in the middle of the desert. And they date to these warm interglacial phases. So when Africa is in one of these warm phases, it has a lot of gene flow. So there aren't natural boundaries, okay? And we think that during the interglacial, 250 to 200,000 years ago, you have one species of hominid throughout Africa. And you have one species because there's no boundaries between them, right? And genes can flow between them. The world goes into a glacial around 200,000 years ago, and what happens? The Sahara doubles its size, okay? So you have a huge area which is uninhabitable. It's sand desert. The Namib and the Kalahari get really large as well. East Africa, most of East Africa becomes desertic. So we have probably 4 or 5 isolated places in Africa where hunter-gatherers could live. That would be the Maghreb here, the Cape here, the Central African region here, and maybe, Ethiopia, well, obviously Ethiopia in here. So what was likely the situation is you had 5 isolated populations of humans. And the Ethiopian fossils that you're talking about are one of those. Now, one of those populations, not all of them, gives rise to all modern humans. And the reason we know not all of them is because the genetic diversity of modern humans is tiny. And if the progenitor population was equally sampled from all of those, you would retain all the genetic diversity from the long time of human evolution. So to give you an idea, if you took a person from Japan, a Spaniard, a Khoi, Native American Indian, and you measured their genetic diversity, their diversity is smaller than any two chimps from the same social group. That's an astonishing fact, right? We are so closely related. Why? Because we all come from a small group of people. You see what I'm saying? We are so... Sorry?
It wasn't a migration event, it was a population extinction.
So, yeah, so you've got, let's say, 5 to 7 populations during that glacial. And then we go into an interglacial 120,000 years ago. And the easiest explanation is that only one of them gives rise to everybody else. So our question then becomes, which one? And what I've argued is it was this one. Now there's some good evidence for that. The Khoi population is the oldest genetic lineage on the planet. Their language is the oldest language on the planet. So there's strong signals that there's a great deal of population continuity in the Southern African subregion. Okay, so in other words, you have very ancient people here in the Southern African subregion. And that's a sign. But the counter-argument to that is, oh, well, there could have been ancient lineages up here that are now extinct. And I accept that. That's a good counter. So we don't have an answer. We have hypotheses. Some are stronger than others.
I must recheck your use of terminology by question when you say Khoi.
So I'm in the scientific literature, the word Khoi is used for all peoples who have a Khoi language within the language classification group. So that would include what we would make a distinction between Khoisan, originally the hunter-gatherers, and Khoi, who were originally the pastoralists. So Khoi and Khoisan share a common ancestor. The genetics and the language analysis shows that. So if we sample people of Khoi ancestry throughout the Southern African subregion, they group together genetically relative to other people. But I know that those are the classifications we use in the scientific literature. I know that there are other classifications of people.
It is changing.
Yeah. So for example, there's a recent study that was just published maybe 6 months ago, where the geneticists had sampled some people of Khoi ancestry on the South Coast, actually in the Stilbai region. And it's amazing. I mean, they still retain the genetic foundation of the greater Khoi population that was once present, right? So what I'm saying is that if we stepped back in time 10,000 years, this whole area almost certainly is of Khoi people. Now, many different types, right? Today in Botswana, you have Kui and Ko and Khomsan. They speak different languages. So 10,000 years ago, there could be 20. We don't even know. But by the historical period, we're down to maybe 7 different groups, different languages.
My last question. You refer to the people who traveled from Africa to Australia, and you call them Aborigines.
These people we call Aborigines in Australia, just Australians.
Why do you call them Aborigines if they travel from Africa to Australia?
They call themselves Aborigines.
And they are settlers.
I mean, let me put it this way. All modern humans you could call Africans, right? Because we're all descended from Africans. The founder population out of Africans is black-skinned people. Has to be. The white gene, the gene for white skin is relatively recent. We know that. And it's an adaptation to low levels of sunlight. That's also, we also know, the scientists know that. But what's fascinating is that these people get to the Indonesian coastline very quickly. And they get to that coastline. You cannot see Australia, right? Yet they build boats and sail across the ocean to Australia. Who does that? With Stone Age technology, they have the ability to visualize a new land somewhere they can't see and build a technology to get there. It's astonishing. That's modern humans.
Goodness, it's not that astonishing. They were all married to very troublesome wives.
What is the influence of continental drift?
Continental drift.
What are
Okay.
you saying now?
So continental drift happens at much longer time scales and much slower. So when modern humans are exiting out of Africa, the position of these landscapes is basically the same as it is today. Okay, so continental drift is relevant at hundreds of millions of years time scale. The landscape is pretty much the same. We know that there was always, during the period of modern humans getting to Australia, there was always a water bridge, a waterway there. There was no land bridge.
So that means that Australia was part of South Africa.
Well, Australia was connected to South Africa, what was it, 300 million, 400 million?
250 million.
250.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get at,
Pengia.
if you talk about Pinnacle Point, where is Australia fits in? Even the people in Australia.
Okay. Australians, there looks to have been 2 migratory events into Australia, from what you can tell from the genetics and the linguistics. And both of those were early, 45,000, 40,000 years ago. They were relatively small founded populations, a couple hundred people. Africans leave Africa 55,000 years ago and they get to Australia. You see, I think it's probably going to get pushed back. Most of this has been dated with radiocarbon dating, which only goes back to 45,000. So I think it's no surprise that the earliest dates we have in Australia are 45. But we have some new techniques now, and I think it's going to get pushed back. My guess is modern humans made it here almost instantaneously.
Will you discover the Pinnacle Point on the Australian coast as well?
It won't go back to as old as Pinnacle Point. The oldest sites in Australia are 45 to 50,000 years old. Okay, so, and that's because Australia, there were no humans on Australia prior to the time when modern humans got there. And those first modern humans are progenitors of all Australian Aboriginal people. So you'll never find a site in Australia that's 100,000. Well, you never say never in science, but so there were no hominid humans here. There were archaic humans here, probably these Denisovans. And when these people came through here, they interbred with Denisovans. So there are genetic markers in Australian Aborigines of these Denisovan people who are now extinct.
What do you think about the Toba volcanic eruption 75,000 years ago?
Well, we're very interested in Toba. And the reason is okay, so Toba is a very powerful volcano, the most powerful volcano to erupt in the last 100 million years, I believe.
75.
Sorry?
75,000.
Well, it erupted 75,000 years ago, but it's argued to be the most powerful eruption for 100 million. Okay? So there's a lot of debate over the climatic impact of Toba. some scientists argue that there was so much ejectamenta that it created a global winter for years, which would have created a near extinction event for humans and other species of animals. So the Toba ash has been found in the Lake Malawi Lake Core. So it reached Africa, and we're looking for it at Pinnacle Point.
Just a very short thank you from all of us, Professor MAREAN. Crystal, can you bring me that red bag as a small token of our appreciation of the crowd that attended, and it was really an eye-opening lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.